If you were dropped into a Viking longhouse tonight, you would be dead before spring. Not because the Vikings would kill you, because the winter would. Your fingers would crack open in the first month. Your lungs would burn from breathing smoke for 16 hours a day. Your stomach would shrink until you started eating things you cannot imagine putting in your mouth. For 300 years, every Norse family north of the Skagerrak knew the same truth. Winter was not a season. Winter was a slow killing. This is the terrifying truth about how Vikings survived the winter. And by the end of this documentary, you will understand why some Norse families did things so dark that Christian historians spent centuries trying to erase them from the written record, because the Vikings who survived were not the strongest. They were the ones willing to eat what nobody else would touch. 1,000 years ago, Scandinavia was a frozen world. Temperatures dropped to -30 Celsius. The sun disappeared for weeks above the Arctic Circle. The seas froze solid. Cattle died in the fields. Old people died in their beds. Children died in their mother's arms. And the survivors learned to do things their southern cousins called barbaric. The first thing the cold destroyed was food. Archaeologists excavating Viking-era farmsteads in Norway and Iceland found something disturbing in the lowest archaeological layers. Animal bones from the last weeks of every winter. Cattle bones. Sheep bones, horse bones. The animals had not been slaughtered for meat. They had been slaughtered for marrow, pure fat from inside the bones, calories the body needed to keep its core temperature above death. But the bones told a darker story than that. The animals that were eaten in late winter were not adult livestock. They were the breeding stock, the cows that would have produced milk in spring, the horses that would have plowed the fields, the sheep that would have given wool for the next year's clothing. The Vikings were eating next year's survival to live through this one. And every farmer knew that if they did it too often, they would not survive at all. Then, archaeologists found something worse. In a cave system on the Swedish island of Gotland, researchers studying Viking Age remains discovered a small collection of human bones. Children, mostly. The bones had cut marks, tool marks, burn marks. The Vikings did not bury these children. They ate them. This is the part of Norse history that mainstream documentaries refuse to discuss. Evidence of famine cannibalism has been found across the Viking world. Iceland in the years after the volcanic eruptions. Greenland in the final decades before the colony collapsed. The Norwegian highlands in the famine of 1257. It was not common, but it happened. And the strangest part is, the Norse had a word for it. The word was neiderot, necessity eating. It appears in legal texts, in sagas, in Christian penitential manuals, warning priests how to absolve a parishioner who had been forced to do it. The Vikings knew what they had done. The Christians who came after them knew what they had done, and then everyone agreed never to write about it again. But cannibalism was not the darkest thing Vikings did to survive winter, not even close, because eventually, the cold began changing the food itself. Researchers studying Norse settlement sites in Iceland discovered something archaeologists call Kestor burial pits, shallow pits, lined with stones, filled with shark meat. The shark was poisonous. Greenland sharks, which fed the Norse settlements of Iceland for centuries, contain enough urea and trimethylamine oxide to kill a human who eats them fresh. Their flesh is biologically a slow neurotoxin. A Viking who ate raw Greenland shark would lose motor control within an hour, hallucinate within 3, and die within a day. The Vikings ate them anyway, but not fresh. They cut the sharks into strips, buried them in gravel, and weighted them down with stones. The pressure squeezed the poison out of the flesh. The cold ground fermented what remained. After 3 months in the pit, the meat was dug up, hung in wooden sheds, and dried in the freezing wind for another 5 months. What came out was hakarl, fermented shark. Modern Icelanders still eat it. Tourists who try it vomit. The chef Anthony Bourdain called it the worst thing he had ever put in his mouth. The smell, when the curing sheds are opened, is industrial ammonia mixed with something older. The taste, according to people who can keep it down, is like blue cheese soaked in cleaning fluid. The Norse ate it every winter for 1,000 years, because the alternative was starving. And then there was the blood. Viking farms in late autumn became slaughterhouses. The animals that could not be fed through winter were killed in a specific order. First, the older cattle, then the weaker sheep, then the horses, if it was a bad year. But nothing was wasted. Norse farmers collected the blood from every slaughtered animal in wooden barrels. The blood was mixed with rye flour, animal fat, and dried herbs. It was stuffed into the cleaned stomachs of the same animals it came from. The stuffed stomachs were boiled, then hung in the cold smoke of the longhouse hearth for weeks. What came out was blodmer, blood pudding. It would keep all winter. It contained more iron than any other Norse food. It tasted, by every modern account, exactly like what it was. Norse children ate it for breakfast. Norse warriors ate it before battles. Norse mothers fed it to nursing babies, because the iron made stronger blood. The Vikings drank the blood of their own animals because the alternative was anemia, weakness, and death. But even that was not the darkest thing. This is where the sagas begin to whisper. In Iceland, in Norway, in the Faroe Islands, there is a story that historians have never fully confirmed and never fully disproved. It is called Eddistop, the family leap. When a Norse family ran out of food in the deep winter, and there was not enough to feed everyone, the oldest members of the family were sometimes asked to make a choice. They could continue to eat from the dwindling stores and risk the death of the children, or they could leave. Leaving meant walking into the snow, walking until the cold took them. In some accounts, the elderly walked off a cliff. The cliff was called the Eddastupa, the family stone. In some villages, this stone is still pointed out by locals, though no one has ever proven that it was used. But the sagas mention it. The Ynglinga saga refers to it. A 13th century Norwegian law specifically forbids the practice, which means the practice existed before the law existed. Christianity arrived in Scandinavia and tried to stamp it out, calling it suicide, calling it murder, calling it pagan. But for the people who lived in those longhouses, in those winters, with 5 children crying from hunger and food for 3, it was something else. It was love. It was a grandfather walking into the night so his grandchildren could see the spring. The Vikings called this a good death. Christians called it a sin. And we do not know, even now, how often it really happened. The sagas remember it. The cliffs remember it. The law remembers it. But the people who walked off the stones did not come back to write their stories. Some researchers believe Eddistop is mostly mythology, a story told to make sense of high elderly mortality. Others believe it happened often enough that medieval Norwegian kings passed laws to stop it. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, which is its own kind of horror. Because even if it happened only sometimes, even if it was the choice of a single grandfather in a single longhouse on a single cold night, somewhere in Norway, a man stood up from the fire, kissed his grandchildren, and walked out the door knowing he would not come back. And his family let him go, because they had no choice. Now think about what this means. Norse warriors who fought the Anglo-Saxons, who terrorized the Frankish coast, who sailed to Constantinople and back, who built kingdoms in Russia and Iceland and Greenland, were the children and grandchildren of people who had survived this. Their ancestors had eaten breeding stock, eaten poisonous shark, drunk the blood of their animals, sent grandparents into the snow, eaten their dead. That is the genetic and cultural inheritance the Vikings carried into every raid, every battle, every voyage. When Anglo-Saxon monks watched longships landing on English beaches in the 9th century and prayed to be delivered from the fury of the Northmen, they did not understand what they were looking at. They were not looking at warriors. They were looking at the descendants of people who had decided, generation after generation, that they would do whatever it took to see another spring. Modern researchers studying Norse archaeology have found something else: famine adaptations in Viking-era DNA. The genes that allowed Norse populations to digest dairy as adults. The genes that produced thicker subcutaneous fat. The genes that regulated body temperature in extreme cold. The genes that made it possible to survive on calorie levels that would kill a modern human within weeks. These traits did not appear by accident. They were selected for, generation after generation, by the cold itself. Every Viking who lived to have children was the survivor of a culling. Every winter took the weak, the unlucky, the kind. Every spring left behind the ones who could do what needed to be done. The Norse warrior who held an axe at Lindisfarne in 793 was the great-great-grandson of someone who had stood in a smoking longhouse and watched his grandfather walk into the snow. He had inherited the body. He had inherited the temperament. He had also inherited the willingness. And the strangest part is, your body may still carry some of this. If you have Northern European ancestry, the genes that helped your ancestors survive Norse winters are still in you. The cold tolerance, the dairy digestion, the seasonal fat storage your body still tries to do in autumn whether you want it to or not. Your nervous system still reacts to short winter days. Your hunger pattern still shifts in October. Your sleep still wants to lengthen as the light fails. Your body remembers the longhouse, even if your mind does not. For 300 years, the Norse people lived through winters that should have killed them. They survived by doing things their Christian descendants spent centuries trying to forget. They ate the breeding stock. They buried the shark. They drank the blood. They watched their elders walk into the snow, and they did not feel guilty. They felt grateful that someone else had been willing to do it first. That is the real story of Viking survival. Not the raids, not the longships, not the gods, the cold. The cold made them, and the cold is still inside us.